Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization. Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our Virtual Enlightenment Salon. We are looking forward to an in-depth conversation on the history of life extensionist thought and the paradigms that have sometimes alternated within that history. My name is Gennady Stoliarov II, and I'm the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Joining us today is our panel of U.S. Transhumanist Party officers, including our Director of Visual Art, Art Ramon Garcia, our Director of Longevity Outreach, Ben Ballweg, and our Legislative Director, Jason Geringer. And our special guest today is Dr. Ilia Stambler. He has previously been our guest during our Virtual Enlightenment Salon of February 13th, 2022, when he discussed his, at that time, 20-year history as a life extension activist. He is the Chief Science Officer and Chairman of VETIC, which is Hebrew for seniority, which is the movement for longevity and quality of life, also known as the Israeli Longevity Alliance. He received his PhD at the Department of Science, Technology, and Society at Bar-Ilan University in Israel. His research has focused on the historical and social implications of aging and life extension research. He is also involved in mathematical modeling of aging and aging-related diseases. He is author of the books A History of Life Extensionism in the 20th Century and Longevity Promotion, Multidisciplinary Perspectives, both of which I would highly recommend. And furthermore, he is the author of numerous published scientific papers. He is one of the most prolific researchers in the longevity field, I would say by far. And today we're going to be discussing, among other areas of Dr. Ilia Stambler's work, a two-part article that he published recently, and this was published by Springer Nature. It is called Reductionism and Holism in the History of Aging and Longevity Research. Does the whole have parts? And the two parts, respectively, are dedicated to the paradigms of reductionism and holism. So the first part covers reductionism and the second part covers holism. And I will turn over the floor to Dr. Ilia Stambler for his discussion of these articles, an overview where he will explain what his research has provided in regard to how these paradigms have affected earlier currents within longevity-oriented thought. So, Ilia, welcome, and please tell us more about this two-part article.
Thank you, Gennady. It's a pleasure to be here. I think it's not even my second time. I think I've been here before, even in 2017 and even earlier. We have a long way of cooperation. I think over 10 years, something like that. So always great to be here. And the last work that I published, as Gennady mentioned, is about the history of reductionism and holism in aging research. You know, in aging research, there is no agreement. There is no agreement on almost anything, even how to spell aging. Should it be with E or should it be just with I? No agreement on anything, but especially in the methods. What should we do to extend our life or try to extend our life? Should we take this supplement or that supplement, eat this or eat that? They use this regimen or another. What should we research? There has been 300 theories of aging, at least, by the count of Joris Medvedev in the 1990s, a famous article on the classification of aging theories. But since then, 30 years passed, I think it can now count in a few more hundred of theories. So it's very difficult to find a common ground, some kind of common denominator, or some common classification system. And if there is one classification that is persistent throughout its history, is the division between reductionism and holism. It's also not an easy task to define medical reductionism, medical holism. There could be always found exceptions, but generally, reductionism is when, as its name implies, is when you try to reduce a more complex phenomenon to a simpler one, or to a simpler element, or a combination of simple elements. And holism is also, as the name implies, as you look at the system as a whole in its entirety, including its multiple interrelations. So that's basically the general frame of reference. And we see that in aging research has been really a silver lining throughout the history of aging research. At least it's very clearly seen in the beginning of I would call the scientific stage. The history of aging research can be traced since the Egyptians. Already in the Smith papyrus and other medical papyruses, there were suggestions how to fight aging. Specifically, aging is a medical condition. It's been a few thousand years, and since there were many theories, but I would say the beginning of the scientific period in this history started since Elie Mechnikov, the Nobel Prize-winning immunologist, Russian/French/Ukrainian/Jewish, he's a man of the world. But generally, I would argue that he started the field of gerontology. First of all, he coined the term gerontology in 1903. So the entire field of gerontology, the formal discipline, is 120 years exactly. In the book on the nature of man, he coined the term gerontology as well as thanatology, the study of death, the scientific study of death. We all both these terms to Elie Mechnikov. And I would say that the scientific study of aging started with his theory of interrelation of elements in the organism, also kind of reductionism. He reduced the entire organism to interrelation of the intestinal microflora and parenchymal tissues, kind of their struggle and unity. So the entire field started about 120 years ago as a scientific discipline. And in this period, we see very clearly this opposition between reductionism and holism. You would be surprised. Right now, aging research is centered mainly in the United States. Like the 90% of funded research is done in the United States, a little less in the UK, a little even less in Europe. And the rest of the world is just dragging their feet. But you'll be surprised that it didn't start in the United States. It's actually started in France and Germany. At the beginning of the last century, France and Germany were the most developed rejuvenation or longevity research superpowers. And that's what these two articles mainly consider: the opposition between reductionism and holism in France and Germany, especially in France, where we can argue that the field of aging research mainly started in France. Mechnikov worked in France, actually, not in Russia. When he formulated his theories of aging and the field of gerontology, he worked in Pasteur Institute since the 1880s. And also what we could call the beginning of rejuvenation research started with Charles-Edouard Brown-Séquard in the late 1880s. In 1889, he reported in a self-injection with testicular extracts. And that we can argue was the beginning of the field of rejuvenation research proper, of scientific rejuvenation research, as well as of therapeutic endocrinology, actually. The entire field of therapeutic endocrinology, what we all take, not all, but many people take, like hormone supplements, hormone replacement therapies, that all started in that rejuvenation experiments by Charles-Edouard Brown-Séquard. So we can say that France was really the hotbed, the breeding ground for aging and longevity research for the entire world back in the end of the 19th century. And that's where we see this opposition between reductionism and holism very clearly. Questions?
Yes, I think this is fascinating. And I know from reading your article that this is just the beginning of the narrative, and we do have time to expound to a greater extent. I did want to ask a question, which is, what happened such that France and Germany lost their leading positions in aging research? I would imagine the world wars had something to do with that, in particular World War II. Clearly, the Nazis weren't that conducive to this kind of research on extending human lifespans. They were a bit more focused on shortening human lifespans. And after the defeat of Nazi Germany, I would imagine there would be some blow to Germany's position in terms of scientific leadership. But I wonder what your research has suggested in this regard.
Absolutely. There was this, I would say, socioeconomic component for Europe losing its leading position in the aging research field, and this shift moving to the United States. Obviously, the Europe was in ruins pretty much after the Second World War, and the United States not so much, including the scientific establishment, the scientific research. So most of the research actually moved to the United States, including some of the scientific immigration, also from France, Germany, and other European countries. But that's one component, one part of the explanation. The second part is actually explained in this two-part article. And our argument is the kind of internal dynamics, internal development or dialectic of this very research. You know, it started in France, as we said, in the end of the 19th century on pretty much reductionist foundations. You know, if you're a scientist, you want to understand the mechanism. You want to be reductionist. You want to understand the complex phenomenon in terms of something more simple that you can actually manipulate, that you can dissect. So that's how aging research started, with dissection, with pathophysiological examinations, with trying to reduce aging to certain influences of hormones or certain actions of particular organs, like endocrine organs, especially the sex organs. Also mentioning of, you know, the entire complexity of aging was reduced to a few interrelated processes, like the interrelation of the intestinal flora of the intestinal toxins versus the parenchymal tissues, where heart tissue and nervous tissue. Very complex, obviously very complex phenomena such as aging was attempted to be reduced and also manipulated. So reductionism was actually needed for the very attempt of scientific life extensionism, to understand the process and to intervene into it. If you're an engineer, you know, if you want to build a bridge, you don't start to think how this bridge, interrelates with the universe and with cosmos and with human values. That's what people in science, technology, and society like me do. If you're an engineer, you want to understand, how this component is connected to another and how you get from this place to another. So that's also how aging research started, as a reductionist enterprise. But then we see that quite quickly people understood that it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. All those reductionist interventions that were suggested, like replacement of certain hormones or certain rejuvenation operations, like was done by Eugen Steinach in Austria, or Serge Voronov in France. Basically, I need to explain what those two interventions were. Steinach basically ligated or bound the sperm tubes with the thought that, suppression of sperm-producing activity would increase hormone-producing activity, and thus, eroticize and rejuvenate the person. That was one major rejuvenation operation of the time at the beginning of the 20th century. And another was by Serge Voronov in France, that was involved transplantation of pieces, not entire animal sex glands, but pieces of animal sex glands, sometimes human sex glands. Both developments were hugely influential for the development of endocrinology. Basically, Voronov pioneered xenotransplantation. All the transplantation that we know between humans and animals were pioneered on those rejuvenation experiments. And also, thanks to Steinach's operation, we understood what actually happens in the sex endocrine system. So once again, it was very important for the development of science. So this reductionist understanding, this attempt of reduction of aging into certain endocrine process. But then people understood it's not simply not working, It's not enough. Aging cannot be reduced to those simple interventions, and it's obviously much bigger than the influence of particular hormones. So all those operations were not producing the desired results. Sometimes they produced some stimulation, some improvement of function, but that was short-lasting, and the results were very confounded. They were done on small cohorts, and in short, all the criticism that you can get in peer review, you can get for those experiments. In short, wasn't working. Rejuvenation of the 1920s wasn't working, and so people moved away, started to look for new explanations, for new approaches, and in the process also rejected the underlying reductionism. So I understood that aging cannot be reduced to a particular organ, to a particular organ system, to a particular hormone. It's much bigger. But then, if it's bigger, then let's think of a bigger intervention. What can we do? We have to influence our entire lifestyle, our nutrition, our exercise regimen, our thought process, Our environment also our social environment. There was a lot of sociobiological theories emerging, also by French researchers. In short, there was a move from reductionism to holism, especially in France in the 1930s. France, that pioneered reductionist rejuvenation, also moved away, was one of the first to move away from reductionist rejuvenation toward a more holistic lifestyle improvement. But then, you know, the pendulum is swinging. You see that when you start involving more and more components in this holistic framework, once again, you start with the entire life course and the entire environment and the universe and all your values. So you see this is also not working. It becomes completely unmanageable. Then the pendulum may swing back to reductionism with some new components. Then that's what happened after the Second World War, when we started to look more at molecular biology, attempted to reduce aging to some molecular biological processes. But we see the pendulum swings back and forth. And sometimes it's at the same time. You know, we can have reductionism and holism at the same time. You know, I use there a metaphor of the forest and the trees. You know, you can look at some system as a trees. You know, you can look at every particular tree, how they interrelate. That's reductionism. And you can look at the forest, the entire shape, and that's holism. So you have some kind of zooming capacity or time sharing capacity between reductionism and holism. So that can be even at the same time. The person can be holist in his lifestyle and reductionist at the lab. But also in terms of passage of time, we see, at least in France and Germany, we see very clearly this cycle of hopefulness. First, you have the great hope for rejuvenation. Here we're going to tinker with the entire human organism, just, you know, get some components and rearrange them, and we'll live hundreds of years. And then we see it's not working. Then we begin to expand into more and more frameworks, more and more components. And then we see this also not working. The kind of the entire deal kind of dissolves in the whole. You know, if you are a yogi, you start uniting with the universe. That there's no end to the universe. You don't know where to start and where to finish. And then you go back to reductionism, and then back and forth. But hopefully, there's a kind of Hegelian spiral when you know, when our knowledge improves with every passage of paradigm. So it's not, you know, it's not a Kuhnian, you know, rejection of the former paradigm. It's both paradigm existing side by side, to kind of reinforcing each other. I would call it, you know, also in Hegelian philosophy, the struggle in unity of opposites. So that's what we have in aging research.
Yes, this is quite fascinating, and I was indeed thinking of a kind of dialectical approach with regard to reductionism and holism, where somehow a synthesis of the two could emerge, because it does seem to me that we do need targeted interventions, but I think we've learned enough to conclude by now that a singular intervention is not going to reverse biological aging. Aging is far too complex for that. But on the other hand, addressing the entirety of that complexity is not possible either. Aubrey de Grey likes to show this huge diagram of just one component of the human metabolism, and he says, well, the issue is this is just one small component of what we know about human metabolism, and there's still so much that we don't know. So we can't wait until we understand all of that complexity to try to do something about the problem of aging. But he also recognizes it's not going to be one therapy. It's not going to be one intervention. It's going to be a suite of damage repair interventions that will need to target different kinds of damage. So would you say that there has been progress toward this synthesis between reductionism and holism? And do we have a promising synthesis available to the scientific community, for instance, in the form of the SENS approach or the hallmarks of aging, or any other approach that you're aware of that has tried to integrate these two paradigms?
Yes, synthesis is really the key. There's still we can hear some controversy among researchers of aging. Some kind of disparage the entire reductionist approach. No, we don't need reductionism. It should be all holism. We need to look at the whole. On the other hand, if you look at those holistic systems, it sometimes amounts to vagueness and just sorry for the word mumbo jumbo. You don't know what you're talking about. It's a whole. It's it's the universe. So, but see, sometimes you see this opposition. It's either reductionism or holism. No, we need both. And need to think of some kind of a compromise. So yes, combined therapy may be maybe some kind of a compromise between these two approaches. But once again, you don't know where you err, whether you err on the side of holism when you get too much components involved, or on the side of reductionism where too little components involved and not enough for a meaningful intervention. But yes, combined approaches is obviously one of the best chances for a synthesis. Still, we need to be clever about it. We need to think for the long term. Also, one of the elements of holism that we need to think for the long term. Sometimes, also in the history of aging research, we see that some rejuvenation treatments looked only for the short effects, like in the case of Charles Edward Brown-Séquard. You see, it's a real paradigmatic example. He injected himself with some sex glands and reported improved function, sexual function, cognitive function. So basically, that's it. The problem of geroscience is solved. We have improved health span, and all this was done back in the end of the 19th century. But actually, he died 5 years later. So we need to look for the long-term effects. Sometimes actually senescence can be adaptive. Actually, senescence and reduced function can extend our life. If we are life extensions, we think not just about improved function, health span. We think about the actual extension of life, and rejuvenation can actually shorten our life. So it's not so easy, but one of the approaches is really to combine therapies and look for the longer term. So that's, I believe, a practical approach. But also in terms of our theoretical understanding, what I believe we should be able to do is to have a more thorough theoretical framework of aging. What we now have is still a kind of experimental, a trial and error approach. Let's give them this drug or that drug. There's no real theory behind it. The hallmarks of aging is not a theory. So I understand it's just kind of heuristic collection of things that look to those particular researchers as important. I could come up with a set of different hallmarks, and some other researcher can come up with different classifications. Once again, classification is not a theory. It's just something that looks to you or somebody else important. And also, we need to understand the distinction between heuristics and theory-based approaches. So what I believe aging research still needs is some kind of theory-based approach, also to connect between reductionism and holism, to kind of connect components in a systemic way to a larger function. That's still missing in aging research. Unfortunately, many researchers of aging simply don't have this kind of systemic mathematical training to even approach this question of balance. What is balance? All those researchers in France and Germany in the early 20th century, they talked about balance. That was the goal. How can you extend life? By having a more balanced, more durable, more stable system. But what is balance? What's too much that needs to be removed, and what's too little that needs to be supplemented? We don't know. We don't have a theory for that. We don't have just the basic theoretical understanding for that. So when I have it, it will be easy, also to devise interventions, more theory-based interventions. What exactly is the stability that we want to maintain? What are the components that we need to influence? So I do believe that the real synthesis will be more kind of theory-based, math-based, and not artificial intelligence-based. Let me add, because as we know, artificial intelligence is heuristic. Recently, one of the books you did mention of mine is recently we published this collected volume, Artificial Intelligence for Aging, for Health and Longevity, where I was one of the co-editors. Also published a paper there on the information theoretical based approaches in aging research. I'm not a mathematician. I just help with biological interpretation. My colleague David Bloch did most of the math, but I kind of put it all together. And the idea is that artificial intelligence is not enough to develop a systemic vision of aging. Some people, put their face in it. If we have huge masses of data and huge computational capabilities, they kind of combine together, and on the output we get the solution for aging. I don't believe that it will happen. I think first of all, the artificial intelligence system, machine learning, such as neural networks, are heuristic. You don't know what comes in, what comes out. It's kind of a black box. And also the data are vastly inconsistent. So I don't know if you have a model working on a particular set of data, there's no guarantee they'll work in another set of data. In short, we need a thorough and a reasonable theoretical approach. Actual theory of aging, like we have in physics, and based on physics, we can devise engineering interventions. Maybe in history, maybe engineering didn't start with physics. People built bridges even before they knew the laws of Newton. So maybe that's how we continue to progress. But still, after the laws of physics are formed, it's easy to develop engineering interventions. In aviation, for example, you don't put people on a plane and see if it flies or not. You actually have solid enough scientific basis to devise the plane in such a way that a good chance they'll not crash. But not so in biology general and aging research. We still throw different interventions that people see how it works or doesn't. Once again, the way towards synthesis is a real thorough theoretical understanding of aging and its engineering and manipulation.
Yes, and I think this is an important line of thought to follow. In our internal chat, Ben mentioned the combination strategy of the robust mouse rejuvenation study, the first study which is being conducted by the Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation, which is headed by Dr. Aubrey de Grey, and I am the treasurer of LEVF. So I've been following the progress of this study quite closely, and the public can follow the progress of this study via this link as well. But I think Ben mentioned it because this study does provide an attempt at a synthesis, in that it recognizes that a multiplicity of interventions in combination are likely to be more effective than a singular intervention. And there are 4 different types of interventions being trialed here. And this is a mouse lifespan study, so the vast majority of mice are being followed until the very end of their lives. And thus far, with the preliminary results, the cohort that has received all 4 of the interventions is doing the best in terms of survival. And by comparison with the controls and some of the cohorts that only received 1 intervention, it is doing immensely better. Like for the worst cohort, fewer than 50% of the mice are alive. But for the cohort that has received all of the interventions, more than 80% of the mice are still alive. And of course, the study has yet to be completed. We want these mice to live for as long as possible. But this does speak to the merit of a combinatorial approach. On the other hand, these are some rather aggressive interventions. One of them is rapamycin. Another one of them is mTERT. Another one of them is galactose conjugated navitoclax, which is a senolytic. And the final intervention is HSCs, so it's a stem cell treatment. And it seems that you can't just subject the mice to a healthy lifestyle and good lab conditions and expect them to live as long as the mice that are given those interventions. So I think this is a good example, but what do you think of this kind of combinatorial study as an attempt at a synthesis between reductionism and holism?
Absolutely, Gennady. Combinatorial approach is probably the most practical way toward developing therapy, as well as toward developing diagnosis of aging. Very important part of a kind of more holistic framework is that you cannot treat something that you cannot diagnose. Great, you have all this intervention. What exactly do you measure? Lifespan, healthy lifespan. In what measure do you estimate the health of this lifespan? In short, apart from developing treatments, we also need to develop a reliable diagnosis. That way, we'll also be able to develop treatments. So also in developing diagnosis, it is very important to combine factors. And that's actually where our approach, together with Dr. David Bloch, comes in. The information theoretical approach, if you read some of our papers as well, you'll see that the main idea is that information theoretical approach allows you to evaluate synergistic effects between factors, and that's the essence of holism. When the whole is larger than the sum of parts, than the arithmetic part of the sum of parts. Sometimes, aging is also frailty is estimated as a score. Let's sum this and this and this. No, it doesn't work like this in biology. In biology, it works by synergy. Actually, if you combine several factors, the overall effect will be greater than the sum of particular components. So that's where an information theoretical approach can be very useful for diagnosis. I believe also for evaluation of effectiveness of therapy. Once again, what you describe is kind of synergistic effect that we can produce by intervention. But be careful, because the synergistic effect can also be negative. We all know very well the phenomenon of polypharmacy. And that's just one of the biggest killers for older persons in actual geriatric settings. They get so much drugs that it simply shortens their lifespan, that simply kills them. So be very careful about it. But once again, if you look at the synergistic framework, you can evaluate also by information theory, by normalized mutual information. You can see when the effect is greater than the sum of parts, and also when the effect is less than the sum of parts. So sometimes you can actually produce a better effect by individual interventions without involving all the polypharmacy. So it's not a magic. Once again, I would say sometimes people, laugh about magic bullets. So it's not a magic bullets. It's neither a magic volley of bullets. So and we actually need to target those bullets, or those volleys of bullets very precisely. And once again, we need a kind of a more sound theoretical framework for these interventions. Why these 4 interventions? Why not others? Obviously, there can be unlimited number of interventions. Still, it is very heuristic. If I could see some kind of theoretical justification, I don't know why this particular combination improved the stability of the entire organ. I don't know what, it's still so much in the cradles, all this discussion of theoretical framework, but still, at least we need to think in that direction. I believe that will be the next step towards synthesis. The combined approach is very important, a great step, and also for diagnosis, also for developing therapy. But the next step will be a kind of a more theory-based justification and understanding also for combined therapy.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. And this is an important insight. Sometimes a combination of interventions can actually be more detrimental than a single intervention. I had a brief conversation with Dr. Brian Kennedy at Longevity Summit Dublin, and this was just in passing as we were walking to one of the morning sessions, and he pointed out, and I think this is a fairly obvious insight for those who think about it, that if, say, intervention A has shown to improve lifespan by 20% and intervention B has shown to improve lifespan by 10%, by adding those interventions, you don't get a 30% improvement. You might get a 25% improvement, or you might get a 15% improvement, or even a lesser improvement. So they're not additive necessarily. Sometimes there could be compounding effects. Sometimes combining the interventions could actually lead to an outcome that is greater than additive, but that's not guaranteed either. And indeed, in the preliminary results for the robust mouse rejuvenation study, this is as of February 3rd, 2024. Here is the link to this update. One can see among the survival curves for the males and the females, the group of males that is actually doing the worst, that has the lowest survival, is the one that has received 3 of 4 interventions but didn't receive the mTART, the telomerase expressing gene therapy, which is interesting. The second worst group is the one that didn't receive any rapamycin. But interestingly enough, those who only received rapamycin have had higher survival. Those who only received mTART kind of have comparable survival to the overall population. So there's more to be said about that. And for females, the situation is even different. So the females that didn't receive any interventions have the worst survival, but the females that only received the senolytic, the navitoclax, have similarly bad survival. Not quite as bad, but fairly close according to those survival curves. So again, gender may play a role in this as well. And this is where we see some of the complexity also. So we can't say that a single intervention even works uniformly effectively for males as compared to females, and that needs to be studied. But I'm curious also with regard to the synthesis between reductionism and holism and what it implies for the individual, whether that would also depend on the time period of one's life as well as one's general state of health. So, for example, I could think of a younger person who is in generally good health, who might actually be risking a lot through some aggressive therapy or intervention for now and would benefit more from generally healthy lifestyle. On the other hand, say somebody who is in late middle age or who is a senior who has a limited life expectancy and has adverse health conditions would potentially benefit more from an aggressive targeted kind of therapy, because without that therapy, healthy lifestyle will not buy that person a whole lot of time. So do you think there's a kind of time-based synthesis of reductionism and holism that could be a guide for individuals as to how to maximize their longevity?
Absolutely, Gennady, absolutely. That's quite a massive can of worms that you're opening here. First of all, when we speak about aging research, sometimes even in our advocacy, you go to decision makers, they tell you, why do we need to study aging? People study Alzheimer's and specific age-related diseases. It's all the same. The people die from those diseases. So why do we need aging? And my explanation is usually that aging research distinct from other types of medical research in 2 major components. First of all, it's looking at the organism as a whole. You simply cannot study aging if you look at every particular symptoms. By definition, aging is encompassing not just biological phenomena, but also social phenomena. And also the idea of neuroscience that by intervention to aging, you can prevent multiple age-related diseases. So yes, there are reductionist tools, but by and large, aging research is holistic by its nature. So that's one. And second, if you look at the aging process, if you study aging, you have to look at the entire life course. You cannot look at any particular period of time. And that's, that's a huge can of worms by itself. Sometimes in pharma research, they study just young people and they look at some short-term effects, and then they extrapolate the results on all the people. There's no way, even in international harmonization requirements, you have to actually look at the effects of particular interventions on the target audience. And that's not what pharma does in most cases. They study some interventions, some drugs on young people, and then give those drugs to old people, and they simply don't work on those old people. So absolutely you have to take into account the time component. And I just named one source why some of the drugs or many drugs simply don't work, because they tested completely different audiences. But we can expand. The problem can actually get bigger when we develop anti-aging therapies. Yes, we should be able to intervene at a later stage when, simply put, people have less to lose. On the other hand, the entire narrative of neuroscience is that we develop preventive therapies, right? So people don't get to this advanced deteriorative stage, don't get those advanced age-related diseases. And how do you test that? You give those treatments to younger people, and then you have to follow up for tens of years, not exactly feasible. But then there's another danger that you will sell various anti-aging drugs that will show some short-term effect, and that will actually shorten people's lives, as we discussed. In the history of rejuvenation research, that's what very often happens. And actually, my big scare that with all the rejuvenation therapies, what we'll be doing will actually be improving people's function for a short term and actually shorten their life. And we have to guard about it. There's some discussion that we have to, test the therapies by biomarkers. Just biomarkers would be enough. No, biomarkers is not enough. You have to actually see the actual clinical benefit, the actual functional benefit, and for the long term. Otherwise, we'll be selling a lot of snake oil that will improve some function for a couple of years, and then the people will live shorter. Like often happened in the history of rejuvenation research. Actually, many of those hormonal interventions did exactly that. They improved the function for some time, a couple of years, and then people died earlier than they would have without the treatments. So a lot of questions arise, but absolutely we need to take into account the time component, the differences between younger and older people. Let me tell you more. Sometimes, even most of the times in aging research, we compare older people with younger people. Just that's how we develop our biomarkers. We measure some parameters in older people compared with younger people, but those people had almost entirely different life course. So what you would actually need to do to develop actionable biomarkers, to look at the life course, to make those biomarkers self-referential, to compare the values in the same person in younger age and an older age. That's also not entirely feasible given the time span of an experiment. So not simple, not simple. That's the bottom line. That's why reductionism was, was essentially abandoned back in the beginning of the 20th century, because some components are always missing. The observation time is not long enough. The cohort is not representative enough. The comparison is valid enough. In short, in reductionism, when we try to simplify a phenomenon, something fall off the track, fall off the horse, and then that's a problem for developing the therapists. But what can we do? We try our best. Once again, we have certain toolkits at our disposal, certain capacities. We try our best, but be prepared that some things will not work simply because it's too difficult.
Yes, indeed. And this is an extremely important conversation to have. Jason points out in our internal chat that this goes all the way back to the Emperor of China and Mercury. He refers to a long history of oops, and the emperor he is referring to is Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China from the Qin dynasty, very short-lived dynasty, fairly short-lived emperor. He died at the age of 49 in 210 BC, and he essentially sought to extend his life, but some alchemists recommended that he consume mercury, and this was part of an elixir that he was given, and he didn't even reach the age of 50, no matter that he was the most powerful man possibly in the world at that time. But there are other examples that are a bit more prosaic. For instance, people who take steroids or human growth hormone may enhance their performance in certain respects for a while, but this definitely poses adverse health effects for them. And I can give another example. So on the day that we had our last Virtual Enlightenment Salon, where you were the guest of honor, this was February 13th, 2022, I obtained a new car because my previous car had been damaged in an accident. This new car was a BMW. So I purchased the BMW because it was readily available. I could buy it the same day I would have a replacement vehicle. Not necessarily my type of car. It's more intended for driving really fast, and it had actually been used for racing events prior to my acquisition of it. But the BMW is built for performance, it's built for speed, it's built for maneuverability. It's not necessarily built for longevity. With this particular car, I have to deal with a lot more instances of components breaking down and needing repair or replacement. And this is easier to do with a car than with a human being, though Aubrey does like to make the analogy between the problem of aging and the problem of maintaining a car. That is to say, even the human body, in his view, could go much farther, much longer, if the same care is put into it as, say, is put into some classic cars that have lasted for over a century. But there does seem to be some sort of trade-off between performance and longevity. And I would like to hear your thoughts as to what is known about that trade-off and what are some of the cautions that people seeking to extend their lives should heed in this regard to avoid mistaking a short-term function improvement for a long-term lifespan improvement.
Yes, yes. I wish this question was asked more and discussed more. There were in the history of aging, there were some attempts at a more profound theoretical understanding of aging, and one of the theories is so-called robustness theory of aging, according to which exactly the improvement of function goes at the expense of reduced durability. And that's a very basic tenet in the theory of robustness and the theory of reliability. Yeah, I wish it was actually more in the discussion. Let me tell you, in the 1960s, there were a few theories of mortality that related it to changes in vitality. All those terms that also Aubrey uses, like accumulation of damage. They try to give some mathematical formulation to those terms. And I would say, like Mildew and Strehler theory and Failla Sims theory, all kinds of theories that nobody remembers. Let me tell you that since the 1960s, there was almost no improvement in the theoretical understanding of mortality as a function of vitality, accumulation of damage and robustness. It's still a very minor component in the general aging research discourse. Most of the discourse is exactly, let's throw this supplement, this animal, and see what happens. And maybe let's measure this biomarker, other biomarker, but still the general theoretical framework is missing. And my hope for the development of the field, actually, that this theoretical framework becomes more prevalent, as a matter of education, as a matter of research, of discussion. We probably need to revamp the entire educational system of aging research, including more math, more system analysis, more engineering approaches. So basically, yes, definitely, and certainly we can find many examples in the history of aging research that short-term improvement of function came at the expense of actual longevity. The original aim. You gave this example of mercury. Actually, it was rather cinnabar. It is a kind of a combination of mercury and sulfur. A very interesting theory behind it. Sulfur is male and the cinnabar is female. Sorry, and mercury is female, and these glows and this kind of Earth-like. That's why by taking it, this compound of mercury and sulfur, you're supposed to live long. Very interesting theory. Probably could have published many papers in Nature Aging or even Science, but it doesn't work in practice. The life is more complex than our theories, but still you need some kind of theoretical substantiation based on data. So probably the way forward is really to use those combined treatments to gather data, to see how different components interrelate, and on this basis we can actually build a more robust theory. So that's kind of a synthesis between empirical heuristic approach and more theory-based approach. So you need data to build a theory. On the other hand, you need a theory to devise experiments to collect data in a more meaningful way. So that's also one of the synthesis, plural, that we need to strive for in aging research. Besides reductionism and holism together, also theory and empiricism that we need to synthesize.
Yes, and you mentioned essentially that a theory can be plausible and yet not work in practice, or at least can be interesting and yet not work in practice. Some of the theories of the early reductionists, at least from an early 21st century standpoint, seem rather far-reaching, to say the least. And for instance, if I were to think of, well, what are plausible ways to extend human longevity, I would not come up with sex gland transplantation. This is not the first thing that would occur to me. Some sort of rejuvenation at the cellular level would be the first thing that would occur to me, but that's likely because I have the benefit of the advances in 20th century biology, which really refined the study of the cell and the processes within the cell, whereas 19th century biology, it seems, was more influenced by chemistry. You add this substance or you subtract this substance and you get certain effects. Now, having studied the thinking of some of these early pioneers, do you think from their vantage point what they were doing was scientifically plausible given what was known at that time? Or were they even reaching too far given the knowledge of their era?
Absolutely. They did the best they could based on the knowledge they had. Actually, the rejuvenation by sex gland supplementation appeared very plausible to them. Once again, the common theory was that sex sex glands or the sex system is actually what provides our life force, and it's you can argue that still has some merit, some value. So basically, if you even read Voronov's writing, he writes, you see, look at the eunuchs, no life drive, live shorter, and look at the some of the important sultans, let's be like the sultans. So that's basically was their empirical thinking behind it. So that was quite reasonable by their standards. And once again, in history generally, and in history of science, you don't how would say, you don't anachronize. You don't you don't apply today's standards, today's notions to early day attempts. You have to look at the actual context. That's what we are taught in the history of science. But I'm not a pure historian of science. I actually want to find ways to develop anti-aging therapies. Learn from the history to trying to see what we can apply, how we can move forward in actual development of longevity therapies. So as a historian of science, I would be frowned at if I try to look at early attempts by today's standards. But as a longevity research and advocate, it may be instructive. But generally, yeah. But so yes, they had the reasoning, they had the knowledge base. But also, what their example teaches us, that we should also be a bit humble. Yes, we shouldn't, say we now know better than anybody else. Even this very paradigm of cellular biology, of molecular biology, let's focus on cell rejuvenation. But once again, this discussion was had even in the early 20th century. People knew back then that the cells can be potentially immortal. But then why does organism ages and dies if it is composed of potentially immortal cells? The famous experiments of Alexis Carrel. I won't go to all the methodology, what he showed, what he didn't, but basically the idea that he advanced, what the cells are potentially immortal, that can be immortalized by their nutritive media. Actually, was the beginning of cell culture experiments that he started, once again, as part of rejuvenation experiment. But why does the organism age and die? Once again, because of the interrelation of all the cells in the organism, because of the central regulation. If you actually immortalize some part of the organism, it can cause cancer. It can, draw all the resources from the other parts. Once again, you need a systemic, holistic perception. So if cellular rejuvenation is kind of still a reductionist, let's reduce aging to particular cells. Once again, comes in holism and says, not so fast. Let's look how these cells interrelate with each other, how with the general regulation at the level of the entire organism. That's where things become immensely complex. So once again, let's still be humble. We still don't have a working anti-aging intervention. We still don't exactly know what we're doing. So I would say we're the pinnacle of knowledge in aging research, and very soon we'll get there. 10, 15 years, and we'll have the drug by 2030 or 2045. No, we need to take things seriously. We need to actually study the process in depth and see how we can actually develop the therapies that work.
Yes, and this is going to be an ongoing effort, even when we start having therapies that show some preliminary success in reversing biological aging. Of course, they're not going to be panaceas, and we're going to need to continue to refine them. We're going to need to continue to figure out, do they cause any side effects that are undesirable, and how do we prevent or get rid of those side effects? Interestingly enough, if Voronov was saying that eunuchs lived shorter lifespans, subsequent data have actually shown the opposite. So here is an article from Alexandra Sifferlin. It was published in 2012 by CNN, and what she cites is that researchers were able to identify 81 eunuchs who were castrated as boys and determined that they lived to an average age of 70. This was from the Korean imperial court between the 14th and early 20th centuries. And this was significantly longer than other men of similar social status. Even the kings in that society typically didn't make it past 50. And also the centenarian rate among the eunuchs was noticeably higher than even in the general population today. Now, this is not a recommendation to become a eunuch or a castrato by any means, but it's just an illustration of how some of these expectations regarding who lives longer may shift over time. And one plausible explanation for this increased eunuch longevity is that male sex hormones predispose men to adverse cardiovascular events. So that's interesting, but it shows that Voronov was acting on a flawed theory, perhaps. But I also wanted to ask in regard to the leadership position of the United States in aging research, because it is still astonishing that 90% of the aging research, as you mentioned, is performed in the United States, even though other countries have advanced research facilities. Europe is quite advanced, Japan is quite advanced, and Japan has the world's longest lived population, though Spain is not far behind. And Israel, of course, where you reside, is quite technologically and scientifically advanced. So what explains the concentration of aging research in the United States? Not to mention that China, of course, is a rising power in terms of its research contingent, in terms of the number of skilled scientists that operate there.
Yes, I'll address that, but first let's discuss a little more the question of eunuchs. Yes, it's known in some studies that eunuchs live longer, but let's think about it more deeply for a moment. First of all, yes, let's assume that they live longer. That's a great example how life quality can actually come at the expense of life quantity. Yes, they live longer, but the quality of life is diminished dramatically, I would say. So, of course, we don't recommend it. And that's actually an example how, once again, how robustness comes at the expense of function. A great example of the need to be careful with our rejuvenation interventions. Once again, we may improve function, but shorten people's life. On the other hand, we can extend life, but destroy people's quality of life, even their will to live. That's one great example for the need to be careful. Another example is, we mentioned Voronov. Voronov made those observations when he was kind of, at least according to his story, he was physician at the court of Egyptian Sultan. And that's where he observed that eunuchs actually live shorter, but the sultans live longer. And that can have an entirely different background than just the function of the sex glands. We know that the very social status is a great predictor of longevity. So the fact that the sultans live longer than the eunuchs may not have nothing to do with the sex glands and sex function. They may have to do with the higher status. The fact that they were the rulers, the upper alpha dogs. So, well, the eunuchs were downtrodden, just died, as soon as they fulfill the function. So once again, another example, we need to be careful. The many factors, confounding factors that we need to consider. Yes, it's a sex function, but also the social status. Once again, not just biology, but also social determinants. Once again, another example, we need to be holistic to think more complexly. Yeah, and once another great example of the need, to use our head and then think carefully about what we're doing and how we're approaching our life extension. With that in mind, let's think about the leading position of the United States. We say that two major explanations that I can provide for why Europe, France especially, lost their leading position is, first of all, the World War. Actually, after the World War, for a decade or so, they're actually rebuilding the economy, rebuilding their society. And secondly, just the internal dynamics, the internal dialectics. I use the term dissolved in the whole. For example, the French life extension enterprise dissolved in the whole. They started the reductionist engineering approach. They saw it didn't work. They went in the hole, and the entire thing dissolved in the hole. They started to talk about, energies and social influences and this and that. In short, they lost the way. And America, I would say, America and the Soviet Union at the same time. If you read my big book, you say that if Germany and France lost their position, America and the Soviet Union, after the Second World War, they moved to the leading position. Of course, the Soviet Union is no more, so what remains is the United States. And the explanation that I gave in that book was that actually the United States and the Soviet Union had more of this futuristic drive. By the way, not to forget, this holistic drive is very strongly connected with traditionalism, especially in France and Germany. What's traditional? Let's eat healthy, and then let's pray, and let's read our ancestors, what they say about life extension, what example and what advice they give. So very often holism goes hand in hand with traditionalism, with all those regimens that are known for hundreds and thousands of years since Hippocrates. Reductionism is pioneering by its nature. It's something, you look at something new, you develop certain new penetrating vision of the phenomena, and that's what the United States and Soviet Union had, just simply by virtue of their dream, of their progressive dream. On the Soviet side, it was kind of a communist dream. On the American side, it was kind of the American dream. Basically, whatever you call the American dream is it, progressive looking development, self-actualization, growth, and all of this goes hand in hand with research, with scientific research, and also with reductionism, also with the pioneering understanding. So when Europe lost this vision, lost this futuristic drive, the United States and the Soviet Union still had it. And that maybe explains why research shifted there. But as the Soviet Union disappeared, ceased to exist, what we have is the United States. And that's great. But what I observe now is the United States is still kind of losing some of its pioneering approach. Now I see a lot of stagnation, even in terms of life expectancy. If we had life expectancy growing for the past 100 years, I see in the United States, it started the first, the entire world, the life expectancy started to stagnate at least 7 years ago, even before COVID. So I see, the United States is also losing this futuristic, this positive vision of the future. But I hope, it is renewed or reinforced, and also not just in the United States, but everywhere. That's what we try to do in Israel, probably with my Soviet background that I have, I'm kind of importing some of the positive futuristic vision here in Israel, and hopefully it will be imported or at least advanced elsewhere in China and throughout the world.
Yes, indeed. It does seem, unfortunately, that there is a kind of lingering stagnation in the United States, especially in terms of the physical infrastructure of our societies, but also in terms of the culture and the lack of a hopeful outlook toward the future in the general population. One of the main contributors to the decline in life expectancy in the United States are deaths of despair among the middle-aged, so people who die from alcoholism or drug overdoses or other preventable causes. And this began to happen before the COVID pandemic. Obviously, COVID exacerbated mortality, but one reason why US life expectancy still hasn't recovered to pre-COVID levels, whereas in other countries, for the most part, it has, is because of these cultural phenomena. And this is why it's imperative for the US to regain this sense of hopeful purpose. This is what I'm hoping transhumanism can provide, because, as you pointed out, the United States has historically been more receptive to futuristic, progressive currents of thought. And transhumanism can offer this system of meaning, not just in terms of using science and technology to help people live longer, but also to give them something to live for, a bright and hopeful future for which they would want to extend their lifespans, but also not shorten their lifespans through self-destructive behaviors. So this is, again, an important thread to continue to follow and emphasize. And since we have Jason back, he made some important points about holism and some of the challenges with that, because he points out, for instance, it is problematic to quantize a happy life, however long we live. If people say, well, their goal is to maximize happiness, how do you measure that? It's a subjective impression that can change. And happiness, in Jason's view, is really a matter of our consensus of what happiness is, or our outlook. So some people say, well, if you change your outlook, you'll be happier. But does that really objectively improve your life? Does it improve the length of your life? Does it improve your health? Or is that just a coping mechanism to respond to whatever is in your environment? So if you say, I'm going to change my outlook, I'm going to look on the bright side of life, maybe there's some sort of placebo effect that could improve your health a little bit. But if you have some sort of major degenerative condition, or the big one, which we are all subject to, which is aging, that's not going to reverse that to any meaningful extent. So what do you think about that critique of holism? It does seem to me happiness, balance, they're good concepts, good ideals to strive for, but in terms of specific action items, they don't provide as much guidance as a more rigorous framework would.
Absolutely, yes. That's also what I mentioned in the article, and even throughout the larger book. Holism is not unproblematic. Some research say, reductionists, let's forget about reduction. It's too narrow, it's too one-sided. Let's go with holism. But holism is also not unproblematic. And one of the problems is exactly that sometimes it's simply vague. Sometimes it's even amounts to superstition. Who told you that happiness actually extends life? No, actually, there were empirical studies, that the longest lived people are not the happiest people and not the most content people or satisfied people. They're actually the most resilient, the most driven, the most dogged people, who actually see all the problems around and actually want to push through. They may be even more critical about the world and more skeptical than others. And those are the people who live longer, not the happy, touchy feeling, everything is great and, everything everything is positive. No, and actually, the people who actually have a more critical, more aggressive even attitude, they may tend to live longer. So once again, it's an example of the need to be careful to actually see your premises, your knowledge base, to see what's based on fact, what's based on superstition, what's based on hearsay. Holism is not about being happy and smiling all the time. It's about actually seeing all those components and trying to work with them. If it answers.
Yes, absolutely. And this is good news for me because I don't think I could be characterized by anybody as a particularly happy-go-lucky person. I've said before that if I have an emotional set point to which my attitudes toward life revert, on a scale from -10 to 10, I'm probably somewhere around a -1 or a -2. So kind of grim realism, but not really a pessimism, just there are problems to be solved and there are constantly going to be suboptimalities in life, and I'm going to identify them and I'm going to try to deal with them. I'm not going to adopt this attitude that everything that happens is for the best. By the way, one of the longest living men in history, he's at number 9 right now at 113 years, 330 days. He was the oldest man for a little while between 2016 and August 11th, 2017, is Yisrael Kristall. He almost reached 114 years. He lived to 113 years, 330 days, and he was a Holocaust survivor. So that's quite interesting as well. Clearly, he did not have the happiest life. He lost his wife in the Holocaust, and yet he went on and he even was a small business owner selling candy. So that's a fascinating story, but it shows his resilience that he was able to sell candy for a living after having survived the Holocaust. Now, I think cultivating resilience as an individual could be a good life strategy generally, and perhaps it could extend longevity just because people fight harder against the obstacles that they encounter, and that might include the medical conditions that are highly life-threatening, but maybe they'll seek out the doctors who could help them. They'll seek out the experimental treatments that could save their lives, whereas others might give up in resignation. So very interesting insights.
Just want to sympathize with your life position. I also share it, I would say. Some people ask me, with all those criticism you raise about aging research and this doesn't work and that doesn't work and this complexity, why are you so pessimistic? I'm not pessimistic. I'm skeptical. There's a difference. I'm skeptical. I see what can work, what doesn't, where a problem lies, but I'm optimistic. I dedicated my life to life extension research. I want it to work. I want to do everything I can that it works. But we can't, just put blinkers and ignore problems and hope that by 2030 everything will work out by itself. We actually need to be realistic, but also resilient and driven toward our actual goal.
I really appreciate people like you and Gennady because you're realists. And, maybe I'm a little more emotional than you guys, and maybe I'm a little more, I don't know, happier or whatever that is, but I really appreciate you being real. It's the realism. So anyway, go ahead, Gennady. I just had a...
Well, thank you very much, Jason. I appreciate your good words. And yes, I think this is an outlook that is needed to solve problems that will inevitably arise in any system or in one's own life. It's good to have in a society a diversity of personalities as well, because different personalities may be better suited to different kinds of tasks or events that could arise. And one can provide numerous examples of this. I want to open this up to questions from the panel. So let's start with Art Ramon.
Yeah, you were speaking of time-based intervention. I know that in my late 30s, I think that's when I started to have problems with slow digestion. Like in my 20s, I would eat and I would just digest it really quick. But towards the end of my 30s, digestion was slower. And I think that contributed to a vitamin D deficiency. It's like somehow the body wasn't able to, absorb the proper nutrients. And I know that one of the hallmarks of aging is dysbiosis, which is basically the microbiome. And I know they've kind of looked at the microbiome, but as far as testing, I mean, can you test your microbiome to see what's within specs? I know they say that people who live in hunter-gatherer cultures have a better microbiome, but as far as longevity research, I mean, I see articles that says that it's a key indicator, but is anyone actually doing any testing deeper into how you can test someone to see whether they have a healthy microbiome that, isn't going to affect them negatively, like I think it affected me with the vitamin D deficiency?
Of course, and there's a massive amount of research going on microbiome, and it's entering the so-called longevity clinics that are popping up like mushrooms after the rain. So my microbiome is a big part of the current longevity field. But let me tell you, in terms of the history of aging research, as I mentioned, aging research started with Eli Mechnikov, and I would say the main part of his aging theory was about microbiome. He didn't use the term microbiome; it's a more recent term, but basically that was exactly about that, about the influence of intestinal microflora on our health. Which also gave birth to the practice of probiotic diets. It all started with Mechnikov 120 years ago. So yes, definitely, even back then, the study of microbiome was a huge part of aging research and aging intervention. And I can tell you more. Much of it simply was forgotten. Now, even a few months ago, we had this groundbreaking sensational announcement about, as they said, the first or one of the first transplantation of microbiome, basically a transplantation of feces from younger to old individuals with some miraculous result. Let me tell you, in the 1930s, that was a very strong line of research, especially in the Soviet Union, by Professor Shipachov. I believe in Novosibirsk and in Siberia, some city nobody heard about here. And back in the 1930s, in the first gerontological conference in Kiev, which took place in 1938, under the leadership of Professor Bogomolets, he described this intervention, the transplantation of microbiome, what we call today. And he said that's such a reasonable procedure, that's such a beneficial intervention that soon, in a few decades, we'll have it routinely performed as a prophylactic. So here we are, 85 years later, and still it's just re-emerging, and we hear about the sensational first in the world discoveries of America. So basically, once again, an example of that we need to be, on the one hand, humble. On the other hand, we need to study history more and find all kinds of interesting directions that were there and were just suppressed or forgotten, that we can dig out. And also, it is an important example of for understanding of the huge death valley that exists between interesting scientific discoveries or ideas and actual therapies. You see, even you, who is kind of part of leading longevity organization, and is less aware of the possibilities that exist. But can you imagine that this field existed for at least 85 years, maybe 90 years, and still we don't have it in routine practice? That's the huge death valley that is scattered with bones of important therapies, promising therapies, and actually with people who didn't benefit from this therapies. And that's the death valley that we have to kind of ameliorate and help grow into a productive field.
Yes. Now, are these fecal transplants just better because probiotics don't work? They don't make it through the gut, to the stomach? Is that the main reason?
We don't know if they're better. They're just the beginning of exploration. We don't know. In some people, the probiotics do work, in some they don't. So once again, we have to take into consideration the individual determinants, the confounding factors. I would recommend anybody to have a fecal transplantation, but it's an important line of research that needs to be developed. That was suppressed for at least 90 years. So that's why it's important for these.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, and Jason writes, yes, study history more to arrive at an understanding of what has been tried and explored already, so that we don't have to start from scratch and we don't have to follow those same avenues in the same way over and over again. We can actually benefit from what has been discovered in the past and perhaps take those discoveries a bit further. So let's hear Ben's question.
Thanks for being here, Ilia. I will ask, on the whole, was the reductionist late 19th, early 20th century attempts, were they good or bad for humanity? My impression is that they made people skeptical of longevity science, but they also got some ideas going. What's your impression?
Of course they were good. That's my whole point in those two articles, that in order to develop science, you actually need a reductionist approach. The problem is, in practice, this approach doesn't work, which causes people to abandon it toward more holistic approach, which is also important. But they're both important. We agreed that the way forward is not to discard the holism or discuss reductionism, but to try to synthesize them, to see how they can work together, either by time sharing or focusing on particular problems. For some indications, reductionism may be more beneficial for some holism. Of course, it was beneficial. I argue even at the outset of these articles that reductionism is where the modern longevity research started. In France, at the end of the 19th century, all the theories of calcification and Mechnikov's theory of the struggle of the components of the body and endocrine rejuvenation. They all were all reductionists, but that's where aging research started, and that's some of the lines of research, some of the lines of thought that we still continue. We still have endocrine supplementation, we still have microbiome research, all this we have from the reductionist research of French rejuvenators of the late 19th, early 20th century. Of course, it was important for the development of science, but once again, in our real life, as Art mentioned, probiotics don't often work, don't always work. So we need to consider a whole bunch of other factors that determines what works and what doesn't, and that's already holism. So reductionism is important, but so is holism.
Yes, thank you, Ilia, for that answer. And now let's hear Jason's question.
I don't really have a whole bunch of questions, but what do you think is the balance between holistic and what's the balance between being analytic and emotional? And, it does kind of seem like there's two sides to human beings, like we're rational, but yet we got this whole emotional mountain of roar behind us that we keep behind our frontal lobe, and what do you think is the balance going forward? How should mankind evolve if we had control of our evolution?
A great question, Jason, and that's a question that the rejuvenators posed both of the reductionist and holistic persuasion. What exactly is the balance that we seek? Obviously, for life extension, we need some kind of balance, some kind of robust system that is durable, that is not self-destructive. So that basically means balance. And what is this balance, which also includes the balance between reductionism and holism? How do we achieve it? It's not easy to accomplish. Sometimes, one goes at the expense of the other. Once again, you either look at the trees or you look at the forest. You cannot look at both at the same time. It's not working psychologically. Also, we see that if we talked about the time-based approach, approach. We see that also in the life of society and in the life of a person even, these approaches are distinct. For example, in young age, the person turns to be more reductionist, simply is thinking faster. He has to pass all kinds of exams at the university, which are also most of the time reductionist. Let's put certain elements in the proper order. But when person becomes older, he becomes more holistic. He thinks of a bigger picture. He also thinks about the past experience. It's also a well-known gerontological observation that people in old age become more holistic. They see the bigger picture. They are more able to benefit from their wider experience. And that's why it's also, by the way, another complexity to throw in the bunch. If we consider aging as a disease, do we consider this particular property of all the people a disease? Probably not. So once again, we need to distinguish things that are actually pathological in aging with things that are beneficial. But we see that even in the life of a person, at a younger age, he tends to be more reductionist, more constructive engineering, and the later age, more philosophical, more holistic. And also in the life of society, we see on those examples of France and Germany at the beginning of the field, the most of the focus was on reductionism. Then it kind of dissolved in the whole, became more holistic. So maybe the balance is in the during the life course. Once again, time sharing. But I personally would prefer that it existed at the same time, side by side, because these two approaches can be mutually enriching. But as long as we understand that they do exist, as long as we don't discard one of them and focus on cells and molecules and the disregard of the entire world. On the other hand, not philosophizing about the entire world, not seeing the actual mechanism. So I would say we need both with as much interrelation and synergy and synthesis as we can achieve.
Well said.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. And we do need both. But interestingly enough, the tendency that you described of people tending to embrace reductionism more in their youth and holism more as they age, perhaps in a more desirable situation should be reversed. As I mentioned, for instance, in terms of at least pursuing one's health, it would benefit younger people to be more holistic and to some extent more conservative because they have more to lose. And it would benefit older people to try a bit harder to extend their lifespans through more experimental interventions. But it may be a challenge to effectuate that shift in mindsets because, at least stereotypically, young people are seen as more risk-taking, as being more willing to try audacious things.
When I was young, I thought I like felt invulnerable. You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't matter if I get mashed up, I'll heal. I did a bunch of crazy stuff. I'm just saying.
I was a bit more risk averse because, well, the problem of mortality bothered me ever since I learned about it, but I recognize that I was not a typical young person. I still think some of the habits that I developed, or more importantly, didn't develop, really helped me later on in life. And I do think it is generally good advice for younger people to focus more on preserving what they have. And then as they become older, become incrementally more interested in interventions that could help reverse their aging as they accumulate the aging-related damage. But of course, we need to develop those interventions first, and we need to show that they work, not just on isolated individuals or on lab animals, but on larger, more statistically significant populations. And that, I think, is going to be a challenge, of course. Now, in terms of where you think contemporary longevity science is, Ilia, do you think it's more characterized by reductionism or by holism? And has there been any sort of shift in recent history from one to the other?
Well, I would say that it's still mostly reductionist. Still, the paradigm is mainly that of molecular biology and cellular biology, which is almost par excellence reductionist. Let's reduce the entire organism, the entire phenomenon to particular cells or particular molecular pathways, and that's reductionism. Pure reductionism is sometimes those researchers simply not think about the general higher level of regulation, like even neurohumoral regulation. That's actually affecting all those cellular and molecular processes. They just stop at the level of particular cells. Also, in terms of the lab techniques, they're simply not equipped to explore the entire organism. Sometimes they just look at the particular tissues, particular molecular and cellular systems. They simply don't have the equipment, the funding to go beyond. So I would say most of the research is still reductionist. But still, holistic thinking is creeping in, in the form of more profound theoretical conceptualizations. What exactly is aging? How do we affect it? It's not just pure experimentalism, pure empiricism. Also, there are more experiments on actual human beings. Also, a trend is growing, and if you do experiment on the entire human being, you have to be more holistic than the person in the lab. Basically, you have to consider many factors, including age, including gender, including socioeconomic conditions. So, if you're doing a human experiment, you actually have to be more holistic. That's why I think one of the possible ways, progressive ways to develop therapy is actually move away from the more lab-based experimentations to more human studies. I would say holism is encroaching on the citadel of reductionism, but still not strongly enough. But of course, once again, we have to look at the specific domain-specific fields where these distinctions operate. In scientific literature, as I also mentioned in my paper, in scientific literature, the trends may be different from our real life. In our real life, we don't think much about molecular biology. We actually think of what we eat, how we exercise, how we rest, how much we sleep. So in our real life, we're holists. But the question about aging research as a scientific field, here I would say we need more holism.
Interesting. And indeed, the holist approaches are more directly accessible to laypersons who might not have as much money to spend as they might have time to implement certain practices in their lives. But the reductionist approaches are the ones that carry greater promise of actually extending maximum lifespan and meaningfully rejuvenating people. So there's the tension there as well. And I think it is appropriate for a lot of the scientific focus to be reductionist, but I agree with you, there does need to be some supplementation with more holist outlooks to consider, well, how does a particular intervention affect a person, not just in the immediate aftermath, but throughout their lives, and how does it interact with other interventions and other lifestyle choices as well that person might be engaging in. So, for example, a lot of longevity enthusiasts right now are taking metformin, but what's interesting about metformin is it mimics the effects of exercise on the body, but it also tends to render the effects of actual exercise superfluous. So if you take metformin and you exercise, you might not benefit from the exercise as much as if you didn't take metformin. And for somebody like me who runs these days about 30 to 40 miles per week, taking metformin would probably not be any more beneficial than the running that I'm doing already. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, we've discussed your study into these paradigms of reductionism and holism, but you also have a variety of other current longevity research and advocacy activities. So I would be curious to hear from you about some of those and how they are currently proceeding.
Thanks, Gennady, for this question. But before that, you always leave me with the need to address your last comment. Absolutely, metformin is a great example of the need to think in a more complex way. Once again, talking about time-based approach, you don't give the same dosage for younger people as the older people. In older people especially, you have to be very careful about the dosage, maybe reduce the dosage, because, the kidneys, there is a small organ called the kidney that may be troublesome for them. And that's also some of the people that take a lot of supplements forget that maybe in terms of the molecular pathways, it's great to take a whole bunch of supplements, but in terms of your poor kidney, it may be not so great for your entire organism. So that's why you need to be both holistic and reductionist. And yes, we need to be a reductionist in our scientific thinking. We need to understand the mechanism. But the framework I use is that we need those reductionist tools, even the 7 interventions of sense, but then we need to think how we calibrate them together, how we regulate them. Obviously, we don't use them at the level of individual cells, but at the level of entire tissue and organism. So the next frontier will be first to develop the reductionist cell biological, microbiological tools, and then see how we can calibrate them at the level of the entire organism. So that's the synthesis they would want eventually.
That's brilliant. Brilliant. I'm just saying. Go ahead.
Thanks for that. Yes, I'm also trying to be as holistic as I can in my work. I want everything. There is no one thing in the longevity research that I can focus on. I try to be thorough. I try to be, exhaustive if I do something, but I always look for other things to do. So this history of aging research is one of my areas of activity. And I also try to be involved in actual current research. Recently, we have published a few papers with some of the research groups in Canada, in Israel, specifically on the influence of frailty of aging process on mortality and disability in COVID. Remember this small thing that we had a couple of years ago. It's also part of our advocacy to try to convince people that if we want to fight COVID, we also need to intervene into aging. That was part of my activity for at least 2 or 3 years. Now people less remember even COVID, so now we can go directly into advocacy for aging research specifically, and that I'm happy to be able to do. In March last year, we organized an aging research conference in Israel called Longevity Nation. 30 organizations participated, and now we are organizing a new conference in October, at the end of October, the Longevity Month, so-called. On October 28 to 31 will be another massive international conference in Israel in Bar-Ilan University. So I will announce already. So you are among the first to know. You can register already, and we hope to through the conference and toward the conference we really want to advance aging research, funding for aging research, not just for Israel but also as international cooperation with Israel specifically. And now that is especially important, despite everything, we will build the basis for future after the security situation improves. Even though now the thoughts of aging are suppressed generally, people don't want to think about aging, but in times of war, in times of crisis, it's just completely out of people's minds. But still, we try to infiltrate a little bit with the pro-longevity agenda, at least build some basis when the situation improves, so we can expand in the future, because our problems aren't going anywhere. Wars come and go, but aging continues, and we don't have many of us don't have too much time to deal with it. So time is of the essence, and we do continue our activism. I continue my activism. I try to address decision makers, and once again, goal is this conference that we have in October. Toward it, I do hope we can gather many forces together and toward advocacy, decision makers, researchers, developers, investors, So that's one, and also continue my research on policy, because actually besides science we also need the policies to advance aging research. Recently I finished two chapters on policy of neuroscience. Also many criticisms that I have there. Why exactly it's not exactly becoming a global priority. Obviously it's so important, aging research, being healthy in old age, it's not becoming a global priority. There are many reasons for that, psychological, political, economic, even all kinds of perverse incentives that people have. So that also needs to be researched and discussed. And I'm also trying to put together a volume exactly on how longevity policies, bottlenecks, how we can improve, how we can ameliorate. By the way, also an invitation, kind of, if you can think of some chapter, I'll be happy to consider. So yeah, so that's what we do here. And I hope we continue if you have specific questions.
Yes. Well, thank you for that overview of your ongoing activities, certainly quite multifaceted undertakings. Now, it is rather unfortunate that we seem to be lurching from one crisis to the next. We had COVID, then we had the war in Ukraine, now we have the war in Gaza, and of course people in Israel are feeling the damage from that war as well, because you are under constant missile attacks. And it does unfortunately seem to distract people from the goal of overcoming biological aging. Early on during the COVID pandemic, many of us were hoping that the fact that COVID disproportionately affects the elderly would shed light on the problems of biological aging. And there was a compelling argument presented by many in the longevity community that if we dedicate more resources to the fight against biological aging, we would also reduce the damage from COVID. And COVID would not need to be the kind of emergency that shuts down entire economies. But I'm not sure to what extent that argument was understood by the general public, or to what extent it's understood or appreciated now, because it seems now the predominant attitude toward COVID is to ignore it, even though it's very much ongoing and it continues to infect people. And for especially older and more vulnerable populations, it continues to result in significant mortality and adverse health effects. So what is your assessment of how aging has been perceived by the public in the aftermath of all of these COVID restrictions being lifted and people seeking to largely return to their day-to-day lives? Do you see any glimmer of hope that at least some people are understanding the connections between COVID and aging and the importance of tackling aging at the root?
Yeah, great question. I also invested a lot of efforts trying to explain to people this connection between aging and outcomes of COVID. I believe I was even one of the first to publish a scientific paper that claimed that to intervene this paper about the use of mesenchymal stem cells against COVID that we did in January 2020 that made this point. And then after that, we organized online conferences and went to decision makers and to press. I don't see that it made much of a difference in terms of public perception. In this time, the funding for aging enterprises seem to increase, especially in some kind of commercial enterprises. We see the kind of rise of longevity industry with billions of investments. I don't know if there was some influence from COVID, maybe yes, maybe no, but at least in terms of the mainstream academic research, mainstream decision maker, I don't see much of a difference. And I would see saying that generally the pessimistic atmosphere of the time and followed by the pessimism of the war. That's what basically suppressed the interest in aging research. When the situation is generally better, I think there'll be more interest in aging research as well. And even in this paper, you can see that all this therapeutic optimism in France and the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20s, was in the time when generally the situation was more auspicious. The economic situation was improving. The people were more optimistic generally. So we do wait for the better times generally, and that's when hopefully we'll have more longevity research. And we can even see in Israel right after the COVID basically ended at the end of 2022 ended. No, at least in public perception, there were less discussion of it. Immediately there was more interest. We organized this international conference, and we came back to the ministries, to the governmental offices to discuss it. But then, and in October we did this demonstration. Also, it was quite an optimistic event. And after the demonstration, on October 1, we had the demonstration, and on October 7, we had the attack on Israel. So after that, for at least 4 months, nobody wanted to talk about aging at all. Just there were some meetings and plans and the programs. All was forgotten. Now, the situation seems to be improving. At least it seems to be quieting down. At least for Israel, we are able to resume a little the advocacy more. So once again, if we're talking about holism, the other factors than just being rational, than just understanding that yes, COVID is the main risk factor for aging. Aging is the main risk factor for COVID, and that's why we need to address aging. That's the rational argument, right? But unfortunately, people aren't always rational, and there are other factors like general optimism and general priorities in life. So that's why, at least I didn't observe a great rise of interest in aging research due to COVID, as I didn't see an increase during the war. Basically, we could also argue that we need more experienced soldiers, and that's why we need to extend health longevity. Actually, I published an op-ed in the Jerusalem Post. In times of war, continue working for health longevity. I'll try to argue that we need to improve resilience, and that's why we also during the war we need to work for health longevity. Actually, healthy aging is important for everything, for space exploration, for climate change, for whatever you want. It's important that people are healthy in old age, but somehow people fail to make this connection, and all the how do you say indirect arguments don't work. What I observe is that when there is a more optimistic general atmosphere, that's when people really become interested in longevity research, and I hope this time will come sooner.
Yeah, some people just don't get the big picture. I get it. Well, I'm trying to get it, I should say. Hey, man, I think you're an awesome guy. Just saying. I'm really liking everything you've been saying, and I'm a fan. Well said. Go ahead, Johnny.
Yes, indeed. And this speaks to the imperative of trying to bring the good times about, essentially. That's why the Transhumanist Party does have a very broad, I would even say civilization-wide outlook in terms of its activities, because we do recognize that the underlying societal conditions do matter. And as you pointed out, in the late 19th century, when much of the world was at peace, the receptiveness of the public to longevity research was greater than it was during the world wars. And it is so unfortunate that the attack of October 7th happened, because just 6 days prior, International Longevity Day occurred, and we held our Virtual Enlightenment Salon, where you were one of our guests, Ilia, and you spoke about the activities in Israel on International Longevity Day. And 6 days later, it was all essentially put on hold because Israel was attacked. So hopefully this war will get resolved as soon as possible, because we need to essentially restore the engagement from the Israeli scientific community in this shared effort, this war against aging and death. Now, you are also writing some papers at present, and one of them is an editorial entitled, "What Can We Learn from the History of Aging Research?" So could you perhaps offer a preview of the ideas in that article?
Yes, thanks, Gennady. Actually, it will be published on March 8th before the streaming, so we can actually put the link to the YouTube stream. And the idea basically, some of the things we discussed today, basically I kind of gave way to some of my frustrations about aging research. How come 120 years since the beginning of gerontology's scientific field, we still don't, basically, we don't have actual anti-aging or preventive gerontotherapeutic interventions. We still have many, many durations, 300 theories of aging, maybe 300,000 potential interventions, or maybe 3 million papers, but still we don't have something that is proven to work for the long term, something that's proven to actually improve clinical state of older people, at least preventively. So that's kind of a frustration for a person like me who dedicate my life to longevity research and advocacy. That's kind of frustrating. I'm not getting younger. I'm 52 years old, and realistically speaking, once again, some people say, don't say you'll get older. You program yourself. No, we live in the real world. We get older. So I don't know how many more years of active life I can have. Maybe 20, 30, 40 if we don't develop effectual anti-aging therapies by then. So it's my goal, in this 20, 30 years to really do the best to these therapies actually arrive. And for that, we need to be realistic. We need to understand that, things are not progressing as great as we would hope for. Of course, we need optimism. The feasibility is there. It is feasible. There's no law in nature that prevents it, but the things is complex. We saw even from today's talk that there are many components that can actually nullify any effort of an intervention, simply if we disregard them. So the fight of aging is complex, and we need to realize this complexity. So in a nutshell, that was the idea. So what I argued that yes, aging research is not fruitless, as some people would argue. Some people would say that it's just pure charlatanry, just pure academic, occupation, just to pay aging researchers for their tenure. No, it actually had a practical outcome. In the history of medicine, even some of that we mentioned today, like an endocrine intervention that were largely born from rejuvenation research. So we did have a practical outcome, but still it's way short of our original goals of major prevention of age-related disease, major healthy life extension, and just life extension. So that we really need to intensify our efforts. So we should have the triple motivation to intensify our efforts. First, we need to realize the need for anti-aging interventions just for our society. We had a great example in COVID, not so great, but a telling example that if we are not able to intervene into aging to improve aging health, we are facing major social disaster. That's on the negative side. We just need to have those therapies even for our society to maintain itself. Then we have the positive motivation. The science and technology does improve. We have proofs of principle, proofs of feasibility all the time. We just need to move them toward the practical implementation. And the third one is we need to realize that despite all this need and despite all this promise, still we were not nearly as far as we could have been. So we need to actually intensify our efforts. So that's the short editorial.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Ilia, for that overview. And I certainly recommend that our viewers check out your editorial, What Can We Learn from the History of Aging Research? And this is a great point to end our salon on today. The multifaceted motivations for continuing to pursue this research, even though sometimes it doesn't progress in a linear fashion. There may be setbacks, there may be shifting paradigms. With each shift of the paradigm, we still learn something from the previous paradigm and can integrate it into our understanding for what will hopefully be the development of efficacious ways to reverse biological aging and extend our lifespans. So thank you very much, Ilia, for joining us today. Thank you for our panelists' engagement as well. Thank you to our audience, and I hope that this discussion will help all of us to live long and prosper.
Thank you.